These are in chronological, not order of enjoyment, except for the one I will leave for last is my favourite book that I have read so far this year. In January, I read Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon, which is a story set in Syracuse during the war between Athens and Syracuse, where there are a load of Athenians who have been caught and are being kept as prisoners of war in the quarry. And these two young men are obsessed with Athenian tragedy. They come up with this plan to get the Athenians to put on Euripides' Medea within the quarry. And at the same time, we see their lives and the violence of growing up in Syracuse at this time, and the ideas of masculinity and of war and of nationalism as well, and the ways that those things play out, and also the violence and the abuse faced by the Athenians, and how this conflict breeds this kind of dehumanization of the with whom you have been engaged in conflict. And I think that it does a really good, interesting job of looking at that, particularly juxtaposing that with Medea, which is a play about female violence. But one of the most interesting things about this book was the way that it was written. It is really beautiful and lyrical in terms of the style, but it is also written in Hiberno English, because Ferdia Lennon is an Irish writer. So it's written in first person, so the dialogue and the narrative are both told from this the voice of this man, and the voice that he is given is the voice of a modern contemporary Irish man. And I think that that was such an interesting way to use this, because it kind of makes the book echo with modern ideas of masculinity in Irish culture, and also it kind of contemplates the idea of classics and what is authentic to the classics, who can claim the classics, because we are looking at the Syracusans claiming this Athenian tragedy, but also because we are looking at the idea of these people would have been speaking Greek, ancient Greek, so why does it have to be translated into sort of standard English? Why cannot a dialect be used for the way that they are talking? And also then it gives you the idea of the dialect, because classical Athenian is the Greek that we learn, and I think there's just a really interesting play with language, which is something that I really enjoy, and I think it did a great job of. Further by Toby Lloyd. This is about a British Jewish family who are kind of a strange, insular family. There is a kind of uncomfortable thriller feeling to this. And when she was a teenager, the daughter of this family went missing, and nobody knows what happened to her at that time, but she did return unharmed, although her mental health was never the same again. This all happened at the time that the grandfather of the family died, the grandfather that the mother, who was the grandfather's daughter-in-law, was interviewing about his experience of the Holocaust. And so it flashes back and forward in time between grandfather telling the story, the time when the daughter went missing, and forward 10 years, where the youngest son of this family goes to Oxford University and meets this girl who is Jewish ethnically, but not raised religiously Jewish, and her fascination with this boy and with his family. His mother, who is a well-known Zionist and right-wing Jewish political thinker. And it is a really interesting book, the way that it goes into the psychology of the Holocaust and the effect that that has on Jewish people, and the kind of centrality and repetitiveness of the looking at the Holocaust. Also on the way that it looks at right-wing Judaism and Zionism, and also more like liberal Judaism, or various different facets of Jewish identity in the UK and experiences of anti-Semitism. I think it is a really nuanced book. There was a lot of tension in it, and discomfort, and families' kind of obsessions around one another, the fervour with which they view their relationship with God and their Judaism from the mother's perspective, and the fervour with which this girl becomes obsessed with this family. There is a lot of obsession and tension, and I really, really enjoyed it. I think it did a really great job of bringing that tense tone to life, and also exploring these topics from multiple different facets, and I thought it was a really interesting read. In the same vlog, which I will leave linked in the cards above, I read Blessings by Chukwuebuku Ibeh, which is the story of a Nigerian boy coming of age in the 90s and 2000s up until 2010. And he, at the beginning, gets into this kind of first relationship crush with this older boy who has come to live with his family. And when his father catches them in an intimate moment, he sends sends the boy away to this school that is known for its physical abuse and its violence in terms of its discipline. And his relationship, there are also moments that are told from the mother's perspective, and it also continues on past this moment into his relationships with men as an adult, and with the changing of the law around homosexuality in Nigeria. This is a really, considering that sounds like such room for drama and violence, and there are moments of violence in here, it is still a really understated book emotionally. There is a lot of repression in it, both of joy and of fear and sadness and trauma. And I think it is really, really nuanced, the way it looks at his relationships with various different people and their reactions to living in such a homophobic society, and the different culture of being a gay person in a culture like this. And I think it allowed, as I said, so much nuance, so many different characters to explore this idea while still feeling like fully fleshed out and rounded characters. It had this really lovely, simple but compelling writing style that I really, really enjoyed, and I definitely think it is one worth picking up if you're all interested in that topic that it covers. In March, I read Marta by Kaveh, Akhbar, which I know is a book that loads of people loved and put in their best books of the year last year, but it only just came out in the UK in March. And this is the story of a young man who is living in a university town, although he has graduated. He is Persian American, although he was born in Persia, but he grew up in the United States, and he has lost his mother when he was very young. And so there is a lot about grief and loss and identity in this book. He is struggling with his own mental health, and he also works as an actor who pretends to be someone that doctors are giving bad news. And so there is this kind of constant feeling of pretending and playing emotions and kind of manipulation. He discovers that this woman who is Iranian is doing a performance in New York, a piece of performance art where she is dying, and she's allowing people to come and see her and talk to her. So he goes to New York in order to talk to this woman because he is obsessed with martyrs and this idea of dying for a cause. And so there are moments throughout that are scattered throughout that are vignettes of him talking, of martyrs talking to one another, martyrs from across the world and different cultures. This book felt very vulnerable and emotional, and it felt kind of childish in a way, but I don't mean that as if it was written for children. It just felt so, I guess, naive is the word that I want. It felt so directionless and like a cry for help because it's told so much from the perspective of this directionless and sad man who feels a little like stunted. And there are also perspectives of his mother in Iran, which I thought were the best bits of the book, my personal favourite bits of the book. But it is a really interesting look at art and death and point and like kind of a what is the point view of life. And I thought it was just beautiful, but like I said, so emotional and so vulnerable and so naive in the way that it was written, that I think was very powerful, even if it wasn't the most like technically the best in some aspects. In April, I was reading books for the Women's Prize for Fiction, and I read The Wren by Enright for it. It was my first Enright, and I know a lot of people love her, and I always love to read Irish writers. I think there's something so interesting in the sense of humour and the way that the stories are written. The Wren is the story of 3 generations in this one family. It is particularly focused on this mother-daughter relationship. The mother who raised this daughter on her own as a single mother in Ireland at a time where that is obviously very frowned upon, and the daughter who is at university now and is struggling in her relationships with this man and her relationships with sex and guilt, having been raised in a Catholic culture, even if she wasn't raised super Catholic. Relationships with like misogyny and violence and how those things play out her body, and also with social media. Writes blog posts for an influencer, and so this idea of identity and performance is very much part of her parts. And then Carmel, who is this very interesting character who reminded me of a lot of middle-aged women that I know, and she is so like headstrong and has this very different connection with the world. She is very much like on her own terms, and I really enjoyed the way that she was written, and I really enjoyed her as a character. She is probably my favourite character that I have read so far this year. There is also the Carmel's father is a big part of her experience. He abandoned her to be this world famous poet, and he abandoned her mother and went about with various different women, and he is so famous as this really brilliant poet, and his poetry is included and his voice is included, and it is lyrical and beautiful, and he is clearly very good at what he does, but it is difficult when that person who is so brilliant at writing emotion is so emotionally stunted in his relation with you. It was really beautiful, and really, like, it's very much a slice of life, like slow, emotional, like rumination on interpersonal relationships rather than a book with a huge like perspective. And I also did think that some of the more like social media stuff felt a little out of touch, but other than that, I did really enjoy this story. So for that video I read Hangman by Binyam, which was potentially the most interesting stylistically and plot-wise book that I have read so far this year. It is about a man who is returning to the unnamed francophone African nation from which he left to live in the US, and he is interacting with the people from his life who have stayed in this country, and also thinking about his experience being a taxi driver in the US, and with this new story that keeps like interspersing throughout the book. And it is written in this very like dreamlike, disconnected way where you're not quite sure what's going on. The way that he moves through this world is so like disconnected, and it seems so illogical, but it feels like he is so a third person now, like he is so separated from his original culture, but also never was quite absorbed into American culture either, and I think that kind of disconnect comes through the narrative. It is written, it's kind of cold and distant and uncomfortable, and the writing was so like jarring, but in a way that I really enjoyed. It felt very like tactile and staccato. It felt very like it was scratching some sort of itch in the very odd way that it was written. I really enjoyed it, and I also think the ending was really powerful. I didn't see it coming, and I really enjoyed it, so I'm glad that I have read that one as well. It was one of my favourites that was on the list. In May, I read Enlightenment by Sarah Perry, which whilst I didn't love it as much as I loved The Essex Serpent, and I definitely had some issues with it, I did still overall really enjoy the book. It is a story of two people who go to this church in Essex that is very insular, like a small community that kind of eschews the modern world and very strict religiously. And we follow an older man who is gay, but he is part of this church, and also the young woman who lost her mother when she was very young, so he was a friend to her in the church, and her experience growing up through this as a young woman and kind of trying to interact with the world. And our older man becomes obsessed with this woman who has just been uncovered at a nearby big house, who is an astronomer, and we kind of uncover the mystery of her life and the mystery of this house through the course of the book and his interactions with different people, including a homeless Romanian man and a historian with whom he becomes infatuated. And it is a really interesting book because it does this intersection thing that I think Sarah Perry is really good at, and that I really love, the intersection between science, religion and folklore, and kind of a Venn diagram of those things, and a look at kind of history through that perspective. And that is something that I am super interested in, and I really love the way Sarah Perry does it. It's also one of the best written books that I have read this year. It is so beautiful and rhythmic, and I really enjoy the style of the writing. I love the way that she weaves in ghosts, and that these characters are kind of slightly surreal, just pushed slightly further to the point where they become folklore, and the link between kind of extreme religion and folklore and kind of magic and science as well, particularly Victorian science. I really love the way that she does that, and I think she did it so well in this book. She has this kind of humour to her writing that is kind of wry, and I really enjoyed it for all that reason. It's also a book that I think I'd want to read again and experience again, because whilst I did enjoy it, like I said, I had some trouble with the ending, and I do wonder if that would be different upon a reread. And then in June I read Only Here, Only Now by Tom Newland, which is about a girl growing up just outside of Edinburgh in the 90s, and she lives with her mother in a council house, but her mother is disabled. She's in a wheelchair and this house is not accessible, and her mother is always trying to get out of this small town, and so is the daughter. She also has difficulties at school, difficulties with mental health, and this has been caught a little bit, but because of the poverty in which she lives and the time period in which she's growing up, it can't quite, she doesn't receive any proper help for it, and it is what we would now call ADHD, but it is not something that she has been diagnosed with. And this book was heartbreaking, and I really, it's told from the perspective of this main character, who is an incredibly anxious person, and that makes it a very difficult read because I felt so anxious reading it. Going through from her perspective, reading this book made me feel so uncomfortable, but I think that was really well done. And I kept feeling, because she was so tense, like something terrible, something awful was going to happen, and whilst there were moments of tragedy, it was not to an extreme. But this tension kind of made you feel like you were catastrophizing whilst reading the book. And I just thought it does such a great point of bringing this time of life to this place to life. It is written partially in Scots. It's not fully in Scots, that if you were unfamiliar you would be unable to understand it, but it uses it enough to bring the voice to life and the time period and place to life. It has a lot of like spiky, difficult characters really shaped by the time, the place and the poverty in which they are living, and I think it does such a good job of allowing nuance, of really developing these characters, and of exploring poverty in fiction, because I think there can be places where that is either romanticised or sensationalised, and I don't think this book does either of those things, so I definitely think worth a read. And then, as I said, I was going to leave my favourite book that I've read so far this year to last, and that is Mongrel by Hanako Footman. This is a story of 3 women who are Japanese, so there are 2 Japanese women and 1 Japanese British woman, and it is told through their perspectives back and forth. One is a young Japanese woman who comes to the UK to study music and becomes involved with her older music teacher, one of whom is a mixed race Japanese and English woman growing up in the UK, and she discovering her sexuality and struggling with racism and homophobia, and with feeling disconnected again from the world around her because of her difficult relationship with her father, and because she doesn't know her mother, who died when she was very young. And then the other, who is a young Japanese woman who is growing up with her grandparents in a small town in rural Japan, died when she was young, who dealt with this severe depression and kind of the issues with the treatment of mental health and poverty and sex in Japan, because she goes on to become a sex worker. And I just really loved the way it explored ideas of identity and fetishization and racism and music and queer relationships and self-discovery and self-becoming. It has elements of that coming of age story. It was a very sad book that had real tense, horrible moments in it, and I believe I possibly cried or nearly cried at some points in this book, but I think it was the really beautifully written, and the characters, the development of the voice of these characters inside whose head we are, that I think was the most powerful thing about this book, and why it has stuck with me since I read it in February. Those are the best books that I have read so far this year. Hopefully there will be more to come, and the list will be different come January. Please let me know your favourites that you've read so far this year in the comments down below. I would love to add more to my list. If you are new here, my name's Roisin, and I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.